Sure hope you have binged all the previous videos prior to this, because otherwise you are not going to be able to follow this. Hey there, folks. This time we're going to talk about storytelling, specifically storytelling in television. Specifically, what are often thought of as two extreme opposites in terms of ways that storytelling is done in narrative in television: episodic and serialized. Now, as is usually my want, it's something fairly recent that has got me thinking about this and wanting to lay things out in specifics, and that is the most recent season of Doctor Who, aka Doctor Who Flux. Now, I'm going to try, we'll see what happens, I'm going to try and not dwell too much on Doctor Who specifically, because I don't mean for this to be a Doctor Who video. However, the reason I need to talk about this is because when the first episode of that series aired, and I did not particularly like it, a very common and eventually, especially for how often it was deployed, infuriating thing that would happen in my comments was somebody saying that you can't complain about this, it's serialized, you don't know where it's going, you have to wait till it's done. Which is ridiculous, because serialized storytelling still has to start off on good footing and engage you and make you want to know what's going on. It can't just lay out a bunch of mysteries and be like, okay, you're gonna keep watching and following us now, because maybe I won't if you suck at it. But you know what, we're getting ahead of ourselves. At its most basic, episodic television deals with completely self-contained stories in any given episode. Serialized stories, every episode is part of a greater story. So your typical sitcom is going to be episodic. Every episode ends with the same status quo with which it began. Any changes that happen are incredibly gradual, and basically they're just character drift over time as opposed to deliberately plotted storytelling. Serialization would be something like Game of Thrones, which ended badly, but was very much presented in a way that every episode and every part of it was just a new chapter in this greater story. Now, the common narrative is that serialized storytelling is relatively new to television, because we kind of really started seeing it ramp up with things like The Sopranos, The Wire, Breaking Bad. And while with shows like that, certain episodes might be more contained than others, these are not shows that are designed with the intention that you could just jump in on any given episode and more or less pick up what's going on. Everything is built on explicit knowledge of what came before, and if you don't have it, you're not going to follow what's happening. Whereas episodic, especially in terms of television, the general design philosophy of an episodic show is somebody can catch any given episode, and while there may be references or characters they don't know, they're going to be able to pick up and follow, at the very least, the story that's going on within this episode. It's not going to feel like something incomplete, and it's not going to feel like something that they couldn't understand because they don't have all the context. It is designed to stand on its own. And there seems to be a general sense lately that serialized is somehow better. It's a somehow higher form of art, which is kind of funny if you realize that serialization used to be viewed in the opposite way. Because while serialization to primetime and large budget television, that is relatively new. I mean, let's be honest, big budget television is kind of a newish thing anyways. Television was always seen as the cheap medium for the most part. So the thing is that it's more recent in that more high-end, big budget, looks real good, prestige television. But you know where serialized storytelling existed forever? Soap operas. Daytime television. Now, those would still pick up new viewers over time, but part of that was based off the fact that they had decades worth of history that no one was going to get caught up on anyways. But everything was still built on what came before. So you came in not knowing what's going on originally, but then you pick up and you move forward from there, was how it would attain new viewers. And the reason it was done in daytime television as opposed to primetime television for a very long time was because of the presumption of an old model of a family dynamic. The presumption that the woman of the house, the wife, the mother, is home during the day and is effectively a captive audience. Primetime, while it generally does get higher ratings because kids are home from school, fathers are home from work. Like, I'm dealing with the old nuclear family model here. This is all nonsense. I know that. Just roll with me. They're home, and so now more people are going to be driving the viewing, and more households will tune into things in prime time, whereas generally the viewing numbers are going to be a little bit lower during the day. But that daytime audience is reliable, and you can count on to keep coming back, and so you would provide them with stories that aren't just retreads of the same tropes, aren't just the same setup and a new plot, technically the way something like a procedural like Law and Order would do. Is like, no, we are going to move things forward every day so you come back every day. So serialization is not somehow inherently more prestigious or grander. It's, in a lot of ways, harder to pull off, though. Because the thing about episodic, truly episodic, there's also a lot of gray area in the transition. We'll get there. Truly episodic television, really it ends the same way it starts. Whatever happens in the middle, it's fun, it's ridiculous, or it's even dramatic, but we end where we started. Whether it's because it's a sitcom where the wacky shenanigans are over, or whether it's because it's a police procedural where that's the end of that case, we'll move on to the next case. And there are advantages and disadvantages as far as storytelling goes with episodic or serialized. Episodic does allow it to be much more accessible to anyone at any point. You can basically just jump in whenever, get a complete experience, maybe not even feel the need to come back, but you got a complete viewing experience in that one episode. They can be comforting in that way because they become almost reliable. That does also tend them to be very formulaic and often repetitive. Although, depending on the nature of the audience, the repetition might even be part of the comfort of them. Now, serialized, when done well, has the potential to tell a much bigger, grander story, certainly than you'd get from episodic television, arguably even more so than you would get from movies. Because you can do something over a longer period of time, bring in more characters, spend more time, more hours telling this story. However, there's a number of potential downsides to serialization. The most common one being getting canceled before you finish. That's actually kind of a big one. Like, we talk about the shows, like I mentioned, but for every one of them, there are dozens every year of shows that want to be the next Sopranos. They want to be the next Game of Thrones. Or, I mean, more likely than not, what they really want to be is the next Lost. Because that's another thing that serialization can do, although rarely pays off well, which is serialization can spin a mystery over a much longer period of time. An episodic mystery show, you're going to know who did it by the end of the episode. You're going to know what's going on. Even something more surreal like The Twilight Zone or The Outer Limits, by the time the hour is over, you'll know what's going on. Lost captured a lot of people's imaginations by hanging them on the edge of their seats and wanting to know what's going on season after season after season, and almost nobody was happy with that last season. That's not to say nobody was. My partner Liz actually really likes the last episode. But it shows some of the inherent problems with serialization, which is, as much as we love the idea and the image of creators who have a carefully meticulous plan as to exactly what they're going to do and what everything means, they don't actually do that. Not if they're smart. That's what a very dumb TV writer would do, because you need to have it be more nebulous. You don't know if you will lose actors, if they will quit the show, ask for too much money, have to be fired, pass away. You don't know if the network that you're airing it on is suddenly going to ask for more seasons than you originally planned. Hello Supernatural, which is mostly episodic, but it does ride the line a little bit. There was a plan for that show for about 5 years, but it went on for 15. No, all these things. There's so many unknowns. And nobody who knows what they're doing in television has a rigidly locked in plan for a serialized story. You have to keep it looser because it has to be maneuverable and adaptable. And that's part of the magic trick of serialization. Now, the big exception to that is, of course, Game of Thrones, which was fine until they ran out of book, and then it got to that last season and oh, dang. Which also illustrates one of the risks of serialization. Serialized stories are dependent on their endings in a way that episodic isn't and won't ever be. Because, look, no matter what you thought about the final episode of Seinfeld, at the time that it aired, most people didn't like it that much. At best, they thought it was a weak way to end. That doesn't impact your enjoyment of the rest of the show because the episodes are all self-contained. Knowing that there is a final episode later on down the line, well, just don't watch it. Who cares? Game of Thrones, you can't really do that because every episode, every season was building onward to that horribly botched final season. And the things that came before, while very good television in their own right, don't really stand alone. And a bad ending can sour the entire experience. And that is a risk with serialized storytelling. Now, I mentioned that there's actually a lot more gray area than people tend to think about. One of the things that started really coming about in the 90s and early 2000s with your Babylon 5s, your Buffy the Vampire Slayers, your Star Trek Deep Space Nines, and to a certain extent your X-Files, were shows that had an episodic format and template, but were doing overarching stories that were more than just character drift. I used that term earlier. Character drift is just the characters changing a bit over time. And so that if you look at an episode of even like a sitcom from the first season and then the fifth season, there will be notable differences, not because of any major upheaval, but because of little things that changed over a long enough period of time. But again, that's just kind of what happens if you're not going to deliberately try and never have anything change. I mean, the most common example of that is whenever you're dealing with a family sitcom, kids grow up. But, characters get new jobs, they get into new relationships, etc. That's not what I'm talking about. With some of the shows that I mentioned, they were more or less episodic for the most part, with most individual episodes dealing with a specific situation that is going to be more or less resolved by the end of that episode, but also building towards and keeping moving actively a grander story in the background, whether it be a story of political and social upheaval with something like DS9 or Babylon 5, whether it be the moving forward of a conspiracy like in X-Files, or whether it be the big bad moving their plan forward towards the finale of the show for Buffy the Vampire Slayer. There's a lot of middle ground to be ridden, and it is frustrating to me that people tend to talk about serialized or episodic in pretty stark and absolutist terms, as if an episodic show always looks like Law and Order, and a serialized show always looks like either Lost or Game of Thrones, depending on how much mystery they're working off of. Neither of those is accurate. Now, to circle back onto the new season of Doctor Who, just for a little bit, what was really frustrating for me was seeing people use the idea that this series is serialized, this current one, as a blanket defense for any issue, especially the ones that I had, because I accused that first episode of being overstuffed and lacking in a clear central story, which in my mind is just bad storytelling. And I lost count of how many people in my comments told me, well, no, you can't say that. That's not a fair criticism because it's serialized. You're not supposed to know everything. It's not that I expect to know everything. It's that all that stuff crammed in there within one episode, nothing being resolved and nothing being the clear primary thing that we're meant to be focusing on. And no, don't tell me that, well, we focus on the flux. The flux is this vague nebulous threat that is really undefined by the end of that first episode. And it's really lacking in a clear purpose and main thing. If you want to compare it to something like Lost, that first episode, while it piles on a crap ton of stuff that you're like, what is going on? There's a clear central thing happening. Plane crashed, survivors trying to gather and be together and safe. There is a main core central thing and all this other weirdness going on around it. That first episode of Dark Drew Flux did not have a main core central thing. And even if we get to the final episode of this series and it pays off every single plot thread, that will still be a bad first episode for a serialized story, because if I was not already invested in Doctor Who, it's not the kind of serialized setup that would have made me come in and keep watching. Because like I said, there is a long list of shows that have gone in and leaned in heavily on the mystery idea and the idea of come back and watch this story unfold. We'll tell you the answers. But if you can't give us strong characters and a core reason to care, just finding out the answers isn't enough. We have to be invested in what those answers will mean. Because otherwise, it's trivia. We might as well read a Wikipedia page. And that's the thing. Serialization is kind of a high-risk, high-reward way to go. It, if nailed, and I mean nailed, it can capture the zeitgeist and the audience attention in a way that episodic really can't. Not anymore. And sometimes that's a reason to try for it. But when serialization fails, it fails hard. Especially because it's hard to adjust a serialized story. I talked about them having to be malleable enough to deal with some kind of changes, but you can't do a major overhaul on a serialized story without it being traumatic to the narrative and the characters. Because you designed it to move forward and tell this story, but if something's not working, or fans aren't responding, or audience just isn't taking to it, trying to pivot something with that clear a destination or that clear a direction doesn't really work. Episodic, it's a lot easier. Okay, let's shake it up and just change the format. We'll go in another direction. We're not as firmly rooted in forcing ourselves in this one direction. We can pivot and go other ways if we need to. I mean, as a random example, the sitcom Family Matters, Steve Urkel was supposed to be a one-off character in one episode, and he ended up taking over the whole damn show. And that's the kind of thing that wouldn't happen in serialization. Not to say that I want more Steve Urkels in pop culture. I don't. But I'm just saying that having that malleability and that freedom always makes episodic a little bit of a safer way to go. Lower risk. But that doesn't make it lazier. That doesn't make it lesser. Good episodic television is still worth seeing. And it's worth pointing out that at this point, very few things are the pure episodic that things like Law and Order or, 90s, 80s, and earlier style sitcoms were. They're still mostly the hybrids, especially if they're anything even close to dramatic. But at this point, even sitcoms have started getting overarching stories. So, serialization can be amazing when it works. But it can go badly, and it depends on sticking the landing so much. Just please don't use it as a blanket defense for the way something's structured. Well, it's serialized, or this presumption that, if it's serialized, that'll be better. Not necessarily. So yeah, I did end up keep circling back to the Doctor Who thing. Yeah, that's stuck in my craw a little bit. You know what? We'll wrap it up there, though. Serialized, episodic. Do you have an inherent favorite? Or what are your favorite extremely episodic or extremely serialized shows? Whatever your thoughts are, drop something down in the comments. Let's talk about it. Like, share, subscribe. I got a Patreon. That's how I pay my bills. Every little bit is able to help me out immensely. But even if you can't, don't worry too much about it. Because at the end of the day, you are the council. I'm just running the meeting. So until next time, this council is adjourned. Hey, if you're sticking around through the credits, might as well hear some names read out. My Patreon helps support this, and in particular, I want to thank Raven McBain, Bookworm, MJ, Tracy Scrabbit, Vincent Paul Bartolucci, Kaylin Schwartz, Edalyn, Robin Moore, Ross Schultz, and Shayla Gourlay. Want to hear me mispronounce your name? Check out the rewards on the Patreon.